Most history classes on America cover the discovery of the continent, the founding of early colonies like Jamestown and Plymouth Rock, and then seem to skip the immediate lead-up to the American Revolution. That's a pity, because the colonial centuries were some of the most fascinating in the history of the United States. And, as the case so often is in history, by fascinating, we just mean totally hellish. Even beyond the unrefined technology and the roughness of the untamed country, there were many challenges to life across the pond, some unique to the place and time. Number 10. Captive market. While it's common to look at colonial Americans as a self-sufficient bunch, a collection of surviving documents from George Washington himself paints a very different picture. In 1757, he was writing letters requesting everything from raisins to furniture to sponge toothbrushes. The fact was that American industry was woefully unable to produce or manufacture a huge array of basic commodities and were required to purchase all such goods from Great Britain. Many British manufacturers were well aware of the fact that their clients were effectively at their mercy, so many shipments either lacked some of the products that had been ordered or contained spoiled or broken wares. Not to mention all of the goods that were simply dumped on the colonists because they were unfashionable to the point of being unsellable in Britain. "It's good enough for America" became a popular saying on the island, indicating shoddy products. For all the talk of taxation and representation, this was likely a powerful motivating factor for the revolution. Number 9. Numerous surprising and frustrating currencies. The most obvious choice for 13 colonies under the control of a single empire would be to use the mother country's currency. Yet, little British currency was available in the colonies before the Revolution due to a massive trade deficit, which is hardly surprising for colonies that are effectively a captive market. So for internal transactions, alternatives were vital and further complicated by just how united the colonies really weren't much of the time. Throughout the colonies, the golden Spanish coin, known as the Piece of 8, was the most popular, since Spanish colonies in the West Indies, Mexico, and Florida meant a much steadier cash flow. On the basis of specific colonies, Virginia and North Carolina used tobacco leaves for currency. Since these were hardly convenient or durable, receipts for tobacco transactions began being used like checks. Massachusetts used wampum, which were basically beads made out of shells. While on paper the official currencies were supposed to be counted out in pounds, the amount of uncertainty over exchange rates may have meant that it was essentially just like haggling. Number 8. Many wars with natives. Although many popular portrayals of the early interactions with native tribes try to emphasize uplifting aspects of interactions with individuals like Squanto or Pocahontas, from practically the beginning the colonists faced enemies that were willing to drive them back to the sea. Each conflict seemed to be labeled a different war despite their widely varying degrees of scale. For example, in 1715, the Yamasee War began with an alliance of native tribes attacking colonists that were encroaching on their land in South Carolina. It took 2 years of raids before the colonists were able to reinforce themselves sufficiently to break up the alliance. The largest conflict was known as King Philip's War in New England from 1675 to 1676. This cost 600 colonist lives and 3,000 Native American lives. Neither side spared their enemies' civilians or children. Enthusiasm for war among some of the colonials could prove disastrous for their own leaders. For example, in 1676, Nathaniel Bacon in Virginia was so determined to attack local tribes that when Governor William Berkeley forbade it, Bacon's rebellion would result in him sacking and burning down Jamestown. Berkeley ultimately won the conflict and had all leaders in Bacon's rebellion hanged, but the damage had already been done. Number 7. The prolonged witch hunts. The 1692 Salem witch trials dominate historical memory of witch hunts in America, but they were by no means the beginning or the end. The first colonial witchcraft trial began in 1647 in Hartford, Connecticut, and resulted in Alice Young being sent to the gallows. In 1662, Hartford would have a real wave of witch trials, which saw 7 people tried and 4 people hanged. Coincidentally, Hartford had a witch hunt wave of its own about the same time that Salem did, though without such a large body count. It was hardly a daily occurrence, or equally likely in all the colonies. North Carolina, for example, only had 1 witch trial. Considering the flimsy pretext that could be used for accusations, it was a risk that hung over every personal grudge, since That seemed to be the primary motivation for accusing someone of witchcraft. As it happened, Salem's witch trials seemed to inoculate much of the rest of the country to the practice, as the massive loss of life left other communities wary of the potential consequences and increased the standards of evidence. The aforementioned trial in North Carolina took place in 1703 and was thrown out of court for being baseless. The last colonial witch trial occurred in Virginia in 1730, the same year that Benjamin Franklin himself wrote an essay mocking the whole nation. By 1735, Parliament wrote a new Witchcraft Act, which decriminalized being a witch. Number 6. Poorly fought epidemics. It's no secret that Native Americans fell victim to the diseases brought by Europeans by the millions, and there's some debate if the one deliberate attempt at this in 1763 at Fort Pitt worked. Given how well attempts to combat epidemics afflicting colonists tended to go, it's possible that a sincere, concerted effort by the colonial powers to save natives could have made the situation even worse. When one of the dozens of major epidemics that struck the colonial cities over the centuries occurred, the relatively isolated communities that were scattered throughout the colonies were often safe. Unfortunately for them, it was quite common for city folk to flee cities when an epidemic struck, sending out many unwitting carriers. For example, in 1721, a Boston smallpox epidemic sent 900 out of a city of roughly 11,000 fleeing for the countryside. With that in mind, any villager's distrust of outsiders is much more understandable. For the wealthy, there was a procedure that was dangerously ahead of its time called variolation. Variolation was a variation on vaccination where, in the early stages of an epidemic, a small amount of tissue, for example pus from a confirmed patient, would be introduced to the bloodstream of a healthy person so that they could build up an immunity. Because medical procedures and treatments were not fully developed back then, the clients would make the mistake of not socially isolating themselves after the treatment, and so variolation would actually exacerbate the very epidemics that they were supposed to be fighting against. Number 5. Egalitarian bathing or lack thereof. Bathing as a habit seemed to go in and out of fashion, and for colonial America, it was a fairly unfashionable position. It was believed that bathing excessively would remove the natural oil in a person's skin, which would weaken their immune system, so the correct amount was believed to be once every few months, at least as far as full-body bathing went. Surprisingly, this seemed to be the case for the wealthy and the poor alike. Also, many colonists didn't bother with or have the materials for soap. The preferred method of freshening up and becoming less pungent was to simply change washed clothes, a pretty difficult practice for those who were only wealthy enough for one set. Flowers and herbs were about the best that could be done for deodorants. It's hard to believe that these would be up to the task of covering months' worth of accumulated body odor, though. Number 4. Anti-conservation campaigns. For those who feel climate change is a new notion, it actually predates the independent United States by a few decades. The mindset about it was vastly different, however, because it was thought that by clearing forests, the colonists were actually improving the environment. As John Adams wrote in 1756, the whole continent was one continued dismal wilderness. Now the forests are removed. Thomas Jefferson wrote in his 1782 work Notes on Virginia, "A change in our climate is taking place very sensibly." Ben Franklin also wrote about the issue in 1763, stating it was claimed that the snow melted faster on cleared land, although he felt that it hadn't been proven conclusively. It should be said that, contrary to Adams's claims, the Native Americans hadn't exactly left the land untouched. For example, Mohicans had been using fire to clear the Hudson Valley in present-day New York since at least 1000 AD. However, as far as we know, this was to clear land for farming, not to intentionally shift the climate. Number 3. Indentured servitude. Promises unfulfilled. Other videos we've done on this channel have described the fundamental differences between an indentured servant and a slave, but it's not our intention to downplay the hardships of an indentured servant here. Although they were supposed to have complete freedom after 5 to 7 years of labor, a huge amount of them did not live to see the end of their terms. For example, among the indentured servants that arrived in Virginia from 1609 to 1616, 3/4 of them were dead within a year of arriving. As if that wasn't bad enough, consider the companionship of those indentured servants. Between 1630 and 1680, there were 50,000 servants that arrived through Chesapeake Bay, 75% of the immigrants. Of those, somewhere between 6 in 7 and 4 in 5 of the arrivals were men, meaning there were countless servants without spouses, children, or families during their final days. That was likely a significant contributing factor to the next entry. Number 2. Lax Prostitution Laws. For millions of Americans, Nathaniel Hawthorne's The Scarlet Letter was required reading. The novel portrayed the crime of adultery worthy of having a shameful symbol on your clothing for life. Therefore, it would be understandable for readers to assume that punishments for arguably more debauched sexual sins like prostitution and pimping would be much worse. Legal records, however, show that this was not the case at all. There are a relatively small number of cases of brothels, referred to as disorderly houses, being busted, but the worst the brothel owner faced was a small fine or being whipped a few times. In 1753, Bostonian Hannah Dilly was convicted of letting whores work in her home, and the extent of her punishment was having to stand on a stool and hold a sign saying what she had done. Sometimes the police couldn't even be compelled to properly raid a brothel since they were easily bribed by food, money, and so on. If anything, it was civilians that the brothel owners had to worry about. While Minister Cotton Mather tried to launch a public campaign against them and found little support, working-class people were more willing to go outside the law against brothels. Number 1. Devastating weather. The colonies were founded during the latter half of a time called the Little Ice Age, which is generally stated to have run from 1300 AD to 1750 AD. As such, the colonists were in for both frigid winters and summers which were unusually dry and hot at a time when they were particularly vulnerable. For example, in the winter of 1607, the famous and brand new colony Jamestown endured the James River, which was as large as the Thames, freezing solid. This no doubt contributed to the aforementioned high mortality rate among indentured servants. There were numerous winters in the 1630s and 1640s that were just as severe, and even many of the milder winters were marked by immense snowfalls. Bear in mind that many travelers to the colonies at the time were sold on the idea that because the longitude of New England was roughly that of Spain and southern France, the climate would be very mild, so just imagine how unprepared they were. As if that wasn't enough, colonial New England and Virginia were unusually prone to hurricanes. In 1635, one left hundreds of homes destroyed in Massachusetts, leaving 46 dead in its wake. In 1667, Virginia was hit again by what became known as the Dreadful Hurricane. It destroyed roughly 10,000 homes and ruined farms and fleets of ships. To exacerbate the situation for anyone trying to cope with the disaster, it was followed by 12 straight days of rain. Little surprise that the society which survived ordeals like that could take on the British Empire. So I really hope you found that video interesting. If you did, you know what to do. Please do hit that thumbs up button below, and don't forget to subscribe. We've got brand new videos just like this every day of the week. Also, please do check out my other channel called Today I Found Out. I'm going to link to that below. It's similar to this, but not in the top 10 format. So I think if you like this, you'll like that channel. It is linked to below. And as always, thank you for watching.